Okay, History 103. So the first portion of this video was rudely interrupted, I have to say, by a phone call, which stopped my video. So this is video 2 of 2. And thankfully, I wasn't very far into the first part of the video. I'll post both of these on Blackboard, of course, and I'll send them out as emails. So here we're picking up with I was wrapping up with this idea of manifest destiny, right? That this became a justification for westward expansion, for displacing Native Americans. The main conflict that would arise in the 1840s and the 1850s was a conflict about whether slavery, on the one hand, and if you remember this growing cotton kingdom, that was the subject of the last video lecture that I gave 2 weeks ago, would expand, whether slavery would expand alongside the United States, or whether freedom, whether new territories, eventually new states that would be incorporated into the nation, would prohibit slavery. And this was the seed, this fundamental conflict that would ultimately help lead to the Civil War. And the rest of this slideshow, we have, especially on the next slide, a couple of key examples of this, the manifest destiny, as I call it, round one, where we see this conflict play out with the cases of Texas and Mexico. And I have to say that if we were in class, I would have a long, very, I think, hilarious chance to talk about Texas, as you might suspect. Here, for reasons of time, I'm going to just sort of note that Texas was the first area in which we see this conflict play out. Texas had been, until 1836, a region of Mexico. It fought a revolt against the Mexican government, becoming an independent nation. And by 1844, there was a movement to bring it into the United States, but as a slave state. And if you remember our geography, and you can look at a map, that's just an image above this slide, you can see where Texas, of course, is located. So it borders the southern slave states in the Cotton Kingdom of Louisiana and Arkansas. And so the desire to bring Texas into the country as a slave state was forwarded by the winner of the 1844 election, James K. Polk. And this is the first, again, round where we see slavery versus freedom play out. Northerners, people especially living in New England, were hostile to the idea that Texas should be added as a slave state. They were further hostile to the U.S.-Mexico War, fought the year after Texas was annexed, brought into the United States, which was an attempt to provoke a war with Mexico for the explicit purpose of conquering Mexico's territory in North America, all the way west to the Pacific coast. So if you scroll up to that map I just referred to, that's all green territory, mostly what now consists of the southern border of the United States to the north. So that's now the states of New Mexico, Arizona, California, parts of Colorado, Utah. So Southern Democrats, pro-slavery Southern Democrats, provoked this war in order to try to conquer that territory. This led to even more outrage on the part of anti-slavery Northerners who opposed this expansion. There was an attempt to prevent slavery from expanding as a result of the U.S.-Mexico War, this Wilmot Proviso. It failed, but in round one of Manifest Destiny, we could say, I think, very surely, that slaveholders won. We're seeing new territories brought into the United States as slave territories, and eventually states, Texas, most importantly. And this conflict over Manifest Destiny would continue to grow, excuse me, year by year in the late 1840s into the 1850s. If you scroll down to the next slide, Manifest Destiny round 2, we see that an election of 48 leads to the creation of the first anti-slavery political party in the United States, a northern party called the Free Soil Party. Why? Because this party wanted the soil of the United States territories in the future to be free from slavery. In very quick succession, after the victory of a Whig, Zachary Taylor, California gold rush occurs. This leads to a vast movement of people into the West, white Americans into the West. whereas previously, before this time, the vast majority of the population of California was Native American. So this is escalating tensions. Why? California's territorial legislature, before it became a state, applied to become a free state. In response, Southerners in Congress asked for a compromise to allow them stronger provisions to capture fugitive slaves, slaves that ran away from southern states into free states. And I know that I'm talking through these pretty quickly, but the point I want to make here in wrapping up this portion of the talk is that what we're really beginning to see by 1850 in these series of events, again, is an escalating tension between Northerners, many of whom were anti-slavery, and Southerners who were not only pro-slavery but were insistent that slavery should be allowed to expand throughout the United States unchecked. And this only gets us up to the year 1850. If you scroll down to the second main title slide, The Impending Crisis, it's in the early and mid 1850s, going through to the end of the decade, that we only see this crisis escalate. And I'm going to talk through in a little bit of detail some of the events that lead to this escalation. But I want to just take a second and talk about what these two phrases mean: the impending crisis and the irrepressible conflict, because they're very telling to me about the ways in which by the 1850s Northerners and Southerners began to articulate their viewpoint about a growing national conflict. And in many ways they're very suggestive. They're almost self-evident, but I'll explain it. The Impending Crisis is the title of a speech that a New York senator named William Seward began to give throughout the northern free states in the late 1850s. And in this speech, William Seward, the most powerful senator in the northern states, again from New York, began to tell audiences that what was happening through his experience dealing with Southern pro-slavery congressmen in Washington, D.C., that what he was observing, what in fact was happening, was that there was a looming and impending crisis brewing between anti-slavery forces in the North and pro-slavery forces in the South. And that unless Northerners took seriously the fact that pro-slavery Southerners were hell-bent on making the entire nation a slave nation, then that is in fact what would happen. In effect, he was warning Northern audiences that they needed to take seriously the degree to which Southern slaveholders wanted to make the entire United States a nation of slavery. So it was a warning. The second phrase, the irrepressible conflict, is in some ways a sort of mirror image of William Seward's warning. Irrepressible means unstoppable, and that's another way of saying irrepressible. This is a statement, or a phrase, I should say, that was the title of a book that was written by a Southerner. His name was Hinton Helper. He wrote this book published it in 1860, wrote it in the late 1850s. And it was a warning, but it was a warning to Southerners, in which he, in effect, argued that Southerners, but especially Southern slaveholders, were not taking seriously enough the threat to slavery that Northern anti-slavery public opinion presented. And so he warned his readers, and he wrote this book with the intended audience of slaveholders in particular. Said, if you don't take seriously the threat that the Northern public, many of whom individually were anti-slavery, present to the future of slavery in the United States, if you don't take seriously the fact that there is an unstoppable or oppressible conflict, your society, our society which was rooted in white supremacy and slavery, will not just cease to exist, but may well be destroyed. So these are two sides, again, of the same idea. the northern perspective, the impending crisis, the southern perspective, the irrepressible conflict. And indeed, the events that I'm going to talk for the remainder of this talk, about 25 minutes, I think attest to that. And so if you're following on American Yop, I'm now getting into topics that are discussed in chapter 13, which I had as the reading for this week, the chapter called Sectional Crisis. And the sectional crisis simply refers to this north-south divide, the two sections of the United States, the free north, and the slave south. So you can follow along, and I'll make reference to some images in this chapter 13, as we move forward. And indeed, if you scroll down chapter 13, the first couple of sections actually discuss things I've already talked about. The U.S.-Mexico War, this Free Soil Party. And so there's some overlap between chapters 12 and 13 and what I've talked about, but both my slideshow and these chapters have the same major theme, right? This impending crisis, this irrepressible conflict. And it's again in 1854 that we see another national event that escalates tensions between, again, the North and the South. And this has to do with the case of Kansas and Nebraska, and the potential of Kansas in particular becoming a state in the United States. The first point is just a little bit of a reminder, and I would normally talk much more detail about this, but I do want to bring it up briefly here. This point that's titled Stephen Douglas, with the subtitle Douglas, Northern Democrats and Slavery. I bring it up now because it's just a reminder to us that while I've been speaking, including up until now, about the North being more or less anti-slavery, that isn't to say that every Northerner or every state in the North was a sort of gung-ho, we must stop slavery from expanding, we must work to abolish slavery. In fact, there were a significant, I don't know if I'd say a majority, but a significant number of people in the northern free states whose leader was Stephen Douglas, name you see there, who were in fact not only not anti-slavery, to use a double negative, but in fact were a subset of the northern population who actually viewed slavery, if not in positive terms, then at least not as a serious issue. And these were voters who voted for the northern section of the Democratic Party, a party which will be reminded, going back to our discussions 3 weeks ago, was a party founded by Andrew Jackson, and was a party that did the bidding of Southern slaveholders. So there were some Northerners in this party, and they were in general ambivalent. Ambivalent about slavery. They believed slavery was a Southern issue. The South's domestic, this is the term they use, domestic institution. Sure, it didn't exist in the North, but that doesn't mean that Northerners should try to interfere with the South's domestic institution of slavery. Northern Democrats, moreover, even though they lived in states where slavery was not legal, were white supremacists, meaning that they relied heavily on racism to form their view of what constituted the United States and the United States government, that it was a nation that we could call a white man's republic. So let's just be reminded that those people existed. We wouldn't want to say that all Northerners are anti-slavery. And in the case of Kansas and Nebraska, what we see is that these Northern Democrats, again led by Stephen Douglas, the leader of the Northern Democrats from Illinois, a senator, actually had a pretty decisive role in the events that led to ultimately the Civil War. And we see this in the Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854. This act was an act passed by Congress in which Southern Democrats, slaveholders, joined with Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas, in the same party, joined together. Southern Democrats desiring slavery to expand unchecked throughout the United States. Northern Democrats not particularly interested in the issue at all, and if anything, racist and white supremacist, joined together to create a law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise line, the line that went east to west all the way back in 1820, which we've discussed, above which states would be free states, below to the south of which slave states would be permitted. This line was, this imaginary line, was, as per the Kansas-Nebraska Act, simply erased. It ceased to exist. This opened up the possibility, through something called popular sovereignty, popular will, it opened up the possibility that slavery could expand in much larger territorial areas than had been the case while the Missouri Compromise line existed. So joining together Southern slaveholding Democrats and Northern Democrats opened up all Western territory to slavery, all territory that was not yet states. And this led to an outrage among those Northerners that were anti-slavery. And this includes Abraham Lincoln, who had been a minor politician before the 1850s, had been a Whig legislator, a state congressman, and then for one term, 2 years, a United States congressman, who had retired, but was so outraged by this Kansas-Nebraska Act and so outraged by the repeal of the Missouri Compromise that he began to devote himself to anti-slavery politics, giving speeches, for example, writing statements in which he expressed his disdain for slavery and his horrified view, maybe that's the right way to put it, of the possibility that slavery could expand into Western territories. So this is where we begin to see Abraham Lincoln emerge as a national figure, 6 years before he was elected to be the president. The next slide, it's called nativism. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to skip over that just for purposes of time, so we can you can read about that in chapter 13 briefly. Unfortunately, for, again, reasons of time, I'm going to have to skip over that. But I want to continue and discuss the slide that's called the rise of the Republican Party. So we're going to skip over 2 slides because of purposes of time. Now, this sort of escalating tension, this theme, the major theme of what I've been talking about today, continued through the middle of the 1850s. Certainly it escalated after the Kansas-Nebraska episode. In this Kansas-Nebraska episode, in addition to prompting individuals like Abraham Lincoln to become anti-slavery politicians, in fact led to a political realignment. It led to the creation of a new political party. This is how outraged many Northerners were at the idea that the Southern slaveholders were using their disproportionate representation in Congress to try to hijack the American government, the American nation as a whole, and make it a slave nation. So this party was called the Republican Party. It's, just so you're clear, the Republican Party that continues to exist today was originally founded in very sort of ironic, historically ironic terms. It was founded as an anti-slavery political party, which was purely a party that existed in the free states of the North in the 1850s. As you may well know, that's very much the opposite today, right? The Republican Party finds its base of power in the South, but it was originally founded in 1852 and grew after 1854 as a party which prioritized free labor versus slave labor, meaning it prioritized the interests, excuse me again, see, I'm still a little under the weather, excuse me, which prioritized the Northern economy's reliance on free labor, meaning wage labor, versus what they believe to be the backwards, immoral system of slave labor of the South. So by free labor, they meant wage labor, not that people should work for free, but that it was rooted in the realities of the northern economy, an economy which had begun to industrialize, which had begun to become very powerful and dynamic, an economy which was rooted in the fundamental basic fact that the labor force were people who were themselves free, right? So they were free to change jobs. They were free to make their own contracts. They were free to access social mobility. They were, according to Republicans, self-disciplined, industrious. Now, this wasn't true of every single individual, but this is how they viewed their own economy. And they contrasted it with the slave economy of the South, which they believed had none of those attributes. The labor force was not free. Obviously, they were enslaved, right? Enslaved people, as we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, didn't even own their own bodies, right? Slaves did not have, this might be obvious to say, social mobility, right? Slaves couldn't work their way up sort of metaphorical social ladder, economic ladder, obviously. Slaves had no, or had very few inducements to be industrious, meaning to work hard. The only motivation, the only real motivation a slave had to work hard was the threat of violence or the threat of being sold, right? Two topics I talked about 2 weeks ago. So this Republican Party really formed as a contrast, right, to the Democratic Party in the South, but in even broader terms as a contrast to the slave economy of the South. And Republicans said in giving speeches across the North, wrote in newspapers, that our free labor society, okay, this ideology of free labor is what will propel the United States in the future into becoming a greater and more powerful nation, that the slave economy of the South will only hold us back. So this is a major political realignment. And it's in the 1850s, again, that we now have the two parties that continue to exist. Right? The Democratic Party, which we've talked about dating back to the 1820s, and now the Republican Party, which was founded in the early and mid-1850s. So I'm going to skip past the next couple of slides, the cotton economy of the South, largely because we've discussed that already in some detail with the discussion 2 weeks ago about the cotton revolution. And I want to skip past the national crisis intensifying, not because either of these aren't important, but especially with regard to the national crisis intensifies slide, 1856 to 1857. What we have are just more events piling on top of each other. It's suggesting that there is some sort of, again, impending crisis or irrepressible conflict. And the events that you see on the national crisis intensifies slide, you can read about in much more detail in chapter 13, excuse me, of American Yop, and that's section, let me find it, section 4. You can read more about, for example, the events of Bleeding Kansas, and this is also section 5 as well. Literal fights over whether to make Kansas a free state or a slave state. And here we see anti-slavery militants like John Brown take leading roles. We have an infamous event that took place physically in the halls of Congress when a northern senator was almost beaten to death by a southern representative. And you can see an image actually under section 4 of American Yop of one man beating another man. This is just a really unique and horrifying incident in the history of Congress. So what we're beginning to see again are just more evidences of this, again, impending crisis. But I want to scroll down and talk a little bit about the Dred Scott decision before beginning to wrap up, because for a couple of reasons. One, this Dred Scott decision on the slide entitled The Dred Scott Decision of 1857, I think is one of the most infamous, many will say the most infamous, Supreme Court decision in American history. And it shows us from a legal perspective the extent to which this indeed national crisis had intensified. So if you scroll down to the beginning of section 5, called From Sectional Crisis to National Crisis, you can get a little bit more background detail about both Bleeding Kansas and Dred Scott. And you can see a picture here of Dred Scott's a portrait that was made of him during his life. So that is the man that we're talking about. I believe, yes, that same picture is on the slideshow as well. And you can read it a little bit more detail about the man's, Dred Scott's, life himself, but just to state it briefly, Dred Scott was a man who was born a slave, but was taken during his adult life to the free territories, free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin. Wisconsin, at the time, not yet a state. Now it is, of course. And because of this, because of the fact that Dred Scott had been held as a slave, but taken to free territories during his life, he sued with the help of some lawyers who had anti-slavery beliefs for his freedom. And this case took about 10 years to make it to the Supreme Court, where it was finally decided in 1857 by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court named Roger Taney. You can see his name on the third point. It looks like you would pronounce it Taney, but it's Taney. Think of it as there's a W in there between the A and the N. And by the time this decision made its way to the Supreme Court, there were two basic issues at hand. One, was there a right to hold enslaved people as property everywhere in the United States territory, or was there not? And second, could African Americans be citizens? These are the two main questions. And on both of these questions, Roger Taney, who was an extreme pro-slavery judge, said yes and said no. Said yes, the federal government allows slave property to be held in all territories of the United States. Or as I say under the third point, federal government cannot ban slavery anywhere in the territories. He also said African Americans were not, could not, and had not been, were not, and could never be citizens. So these two portions of the decision outraged the Northern public. How could it be that not just the executive branch, if we remember that most presidents up until this time have been slaveholders, plus Congress, where slaveholders had disproportionate representation, but now also the judiciary. How was it that the three branches of government, the executive, Congress, and the judiciary, had been functionally hijacked by slaveholders? So this is more than just about the life of Dred Scott, who by the time the decision was made actually had been free for a while. It was more about the principles behind the matter. Roger Taney said this nation is a nation of pro-slavery law. Northerners said this nation has become hijacked at all three levels of the national government by slaveholders. So moving into the late 1850s, we begin to see this impending crisis really begin to loom, really begin to become a possible reality, certainly in the minds of a growing number of Northerners, but especially Northerners who were attracted to the Republican Party. There was an irrepressible conflict growing. As we scroll down, I'm going to skip past the Lincoln-Douglas campaign, again, simply for purposes of time, and end by talking about the impending crisis, slide 1858 to 1860. So we'll talk through all the way to the election of 1860, so that next week for our last video lecture, I'll wrap up by talking about the Civil War itself. So it's in these last 3 years, of the decade of the 1850s that everything metaphorically comes to a head, right? And what I have here are just two events. They're two of many that I could talk about from the years 1858, 1859, 1860. But they're just two I pulled out, I think, as sort of very significant single events that hurtled the nation into civil war. The first is, I think it's fair to say, one of the most infamous acts of domestic terror in the United States. Now, there's a debate about whether it was a terrorist act or a justified action. I think John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, in which he took a paramilitary unit of recruits who were radical anti-slavery militants and attempted, to capture a federal United States Army arsenal, a military supply depot in Virginia at a place called Harper's Ferry. This he did in October of 1859. He recruited 20 or odd fellow militants who armed themselves, came up with a detailed plan. The plan: capture this federal arsenal, again, military supply depot with guns, ammunition, and take the guns and ammunition and spread it into the hands of slaves, first in Virginia, with the idea that this would trigger a southern-wide, from Virginia to the south and to the southwest, lead to a large-scale slave uprising, a slave revolt. This was his plan. His plan was foiled because he and his followers were captured. He denied that he tried to do anything except to free slaves. And the question of whether it was terrorism or justified action is an interesting one. If we were in class, we would have a debate about this. I think it was an attempted act of terror, personally. But it did, most importantly, suggest to Southerners this time that there were Northerners who were serious about using violence against slavery. So as a single event, this really ratcheted up tensions in this so-called impending crisis. And this led to the election of 1860. To my mind, the single most important presidential election in American history. Yes, including the election of 2020. This is a unique election. It ran 4 separate candidates. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party's candidate. Just talked about the Republican Party, so there's no need to reiterate their beliefs, versus Stephen Douglas, the second candidate, Northern Democrat. By this point, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats had split apart. There was a Southern Democratic extreme pro-slavery candidate, John Breckinridge, and by this time, 1860, the extreme pro-slavery politicians like Breckinridge were called fire eaters because of the fire that they spewed verbally in support of slavery. And finally, a fourth candidate from a party that existed for just one election, called the Constitutional Union Party. This candidate's named John Bell, was a party that existed as a sort of moderate party that slaveholders who believed that there was some compromise that could be worked out were attracted to this one election. Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, anti-slavery. Stephen Douglas and the Northern Democrats took the stance that we should just do everything we can not to talk about slavery. John Breckinridge and the Southern Democrats, we are here to make this a nation of slavery. John Bell and the Constitutional Union Party, let's try to figure out a way to avoid a war. So this election really was significant. Depending on who won, would dramatically change the events of the next several years. And if you scroll down to the 2 maps at the very bottom, or actually to the 2 maps of the election of 1860, so scroll by the image of Harper's Ferry, you could stop and take a look at the image of Stephen Douglas, the short man pointing. His nickname was a Little Giant, by the way. You can take a look at quickly the image of Abraham Lincoln, beardless, right? We usually think of him, imagine him with a beard, but that was actually something he only began to grow after 1858, so there's beardless Lincoln. And then down to the 2 maps that come after Lincoln. So on the first map, you can see the Electoral College vote just by state. And if you look at, of course, the numbers at the bottom, you can see that Abraham Lincoln won this election. He won only states, the blue or purple color, that were free states. And you can see then that he wins all of the upper Midwest, and he wins New York, and he wins Pennsylvania, and he also wins New England, in addition to California, and then the very new state of Oregon, just to the north of California. So he only won 40%, 39.8% of the popular vote. That was enough to give him, if you look at the electoral vote, excuse me again, on the left, enough to give him more than 50% of the Electoral College votes, which meant that he won the election. If you look at the other candidates, everything in orange, the states won by the pro-slavery candidate, John C. Breckinridge. Those states that you see there, in addition to Virginia, which is colored red for this election, all would secede in the months after the 1860 election to form the Confederacy. And that's what I'll begin with next class, or next lecture. And you can see a smattering of support for the other candidates. But this election, if you scroll down, you can see the county by county, and you can get a better sense of who voted for whom and where, and by what proportion. So you can note that Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, the farther north you travel on the map, the more support that he gets. Everything in red, Abraham Lincoln. You can see that John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democratic candidate, in general, the farther south you go, the more green you see. So to the north, more and more anti-slavery, to the south, more and more pro-slavery. And you can see a muddle of colors in the middle there, right? You have blue mixed in with that orange, that's John Bell, mixed in with some green, a little bit of red. So you see that this election was a little bit more complicated than the Electoral College map shows, just like every election is, by the way. So this election set the stage for Southern secession, the secession of ultimately, the states of Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South and North Carolina, and Virginia, and Tennessee. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 states to become the Confederacy, thus beginning the Civil War. So that's where I'll pick up with next class. Sorry about the 2 videos. So the first video, 6 minutes long, this one 38 minutes long. And again, just to wrap this up and as a reminder, the announcement that I made at the beginning of this video, which I made last week, just as a reminder, is that as long as you've been turning in assignments and have been in contact with me and respond to this week's, which I'll post tomorrow, Wednesday, and next week's, which I'll post next Wednesday, discussion board responses will entitle you to an A in this class. And so most of you, as I said, have contacted me about that, but if you haven't, do so in the next 2 weeks. There's not going to be a final exam or a second paper. I'd rather us focus on just getting through this semester and then our own and our family's physical, mental health. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you through video next week. Okay, thanks. Have a great week, y'all.